it would be easy for me to brag about Governor Kunin's work in checking out the forest health in this state and creating long-term monitoring that makes sure that we are not losing our productive forests. It would be easy for me to talk about her work to lead us to, at the time, the very top of the country in terms of geographic information systems and their role in the management of natural resources. She was a powerful voice as governor for clean water, really making a difference. It would be harder for me to tell you things like Howard Dean would credit her solidly for the development of Dr. Dinosaur that's proved to be so critical in moving us to at least a reasonable equity for certain critical age classes in terms of health care. So she's a terrific person. I had the good luck, Anna, I had the good luck of ending up her neighbor, and she's a damn good neighbor too. So I'm very pleased that she will take the time to talk to us. I'm obligated to tell you about a little bit about her, even though it seems silly in this group, some respects. She was actually governor back in while we still had ice in the Ice Age, and it was 1995 and 85. Excuse me, way back in the Ice Age to 1991. She became a major player in the Clinton administration, serving on the three-member team that ultimately led to Al Gore being selected to be vice president, serving as deputy secretary of the Department of Education, and serving as ambassador to Switzerland. In each of those roles, she just did well. In fact, you enabled one of our classes last year, you may not even know this, to go to the Swiss ambassador's residence to talk with him about energy, which was really quite exciting. She founded a nonprofit called Sustainable Communities in 1991, still serves on that board, and therefore is having an impact in terms of this. It's an institute for sustainable communities in terms of trying to seek sustainability now throughout the globe. She's the Marsh Professor at the University of Vermont, which we're very proud of, and she'll talk about her early teaching experiences at Trinity College as an important part of her own development as an effective citizen. So, I should also tout her books, Pearls, Politics, and Power, How Women Can Win and Lead. And I'd also say that has many, many very important examples for men as well. She has written Living a Political Life, and she has written the Big Green Book. She does public commentary, or she does commentary on NPR, and she does a blog with the Huffington Post. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her good spouse, John Hennessy, who for a while actually graced our administrative hallways at the University of Vermont and was a great guy for me to work with, is not with her today because of a bit of a cold. But together they have 8 grandchildren. But I want you to know that there are 6 children producing them, so they still fit with ZPG guidelines. Without further ado, please welcome Madeleine Kunin.
Thank you very much, Larry, or I should say Professor Forsey. It's a great pleasure to join you. And I thought I want to leave lots of time for questions, but I plan to talk a little bit about what got me into politics, my challenges as a governor, making decisions that affected the environment, and how I see the landscape, the political landscape, and what is political? How can we have an impact on how the world is turning in more ways than one? Well, when I'm asked the question, how did I get into politics? And I first ran for the legislature in 1972. And two issues really prompted me to jump over that line from being a private citizen to a public person. And one was the women's movement, which was really bursting out on the scene in the late 60s and early 70s. And there was an issue called the Equal Rights Amendment. I asked a group of students the other day if they knew what ERA meant. And two of them said Environmental Regulatory Administration. But it does stand for Equal Rights Amendment, but this is not the topic for today. The other was the environmental movement. And I remember very well going to a talk and a sort of celebration on the UVM Green, I believe it was 1970, for the first Earth Day celebration. So when Earth Day dawned, I was captivated by it. And also, just before I ran, Act 250 had been passed. Do you all know what Act 250 is? The strong environmental development law that Vermont passed. And the minute it was adopted, people wanted to repeal it. Little did I know then that this would be an annual ritual, and there's still movements afloat to try to at least weaken, if not repeal, Act 250. So right away I knew of the tension between environmental protection and economic development. Even though that tension, as we might understand, is sometimes misrepresented and misunderstood. As Larry mentioned, after I left the governorship, just before I left actually, I was invited to chair an election observation team in Bulgaria. This was shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so I went to Bulgaria and I took along a young man then who was head of my planning and policy office named George Hamilton. And one of our first impressions in watching these political parties and these debates was the environment was a huge issue in the former Soviet Union-dominated countries. And I was told that in these countries, especially Bulgaria, the first demonstrations, public demonstrations, were against pollution and in favor of a clean environment. And they were allowed to do that while they weren't allowed to demonstrate politically. So it was an interesting kind of nexus between environmental activism and political activism. That was the issue that got them marching in the streets and then forming political parties. And some of the posters were environmental posters. Well, everybody else who was in the United States and other countries were very concerned about helping these countries who were under communist dictatorship for so long to develop, free enterprise, get out of the iron fist of communism. But I realized that they also needed environmental assistance, training, education. So that's how ISC, the Institute for Sustainable Community, was founded. And if you want to know more, we have a website. You can find it under Institute for Sustainable Communities. After I left the governorship in 1991, I also was invited to lead a team just to put, global warming in perspective. Sometimes we think it just appeared on the screen last week. But in 1991, I led a group of people to go to China to study global warming. It was not really a tourist trip because we went to the most polluted parts of China. And it was very sobering for me and for all of us, because I realized, we went to steel factory towns where people could barely breathe. I felt certain I was taking 10 years off my own life. And I concluded that kind of pollution was really a human rights issue. And I think the Chinese authorities now, then they thought, what are you talking about, in 1991. But I think now they realize it is a huge public health and economic issue, because people are dying at a higher than normal rate, as is true in parts of Russia and other highly polluted parts of the world. So I always, felt drawn to the environmental movement, not only as an abstract issue, but as an issue that affects our lives very directly. Now, when we talk about what we can do, obviously, politics works on many, many levels, and the personal is political. That was a slogan for the women's movement years ago, but it's also true for the environmental movement. And while our own behavior may not have a huge impact, but the cumulative behavior does have an impact. And I think we're in a very interesting time in that regard, where people are changing their habits. Sometimes you have to be careful to how do you figure out what's real and what's just glitzy, what's just fashionable. They're environmental, they're green fashions, they're green everything. And you have to sort of put on your glasses and say, is this really green, or is this just another sales pitch? Which sometimes it is. But even the fact that they believe green sells is a change in our culture. When I was governor, one of the controversial things we did, and Jonathan Lash was my Secretary of Environmental Conservation. He now heads an organization called the World Resources Institute. Well, when we told people, they had to close the old landfills and build lined landfills, they really protested when we said, you're going to be charged for what you throw away. We're going to have fees in order to build these new landfills. People were very angry. Now, of course, it's totally acceptable. So change is possible. I'm tempted to tell one story, but I don't want to tell too many stories. Shortly after I was elected governor, the previous administration had cited new landfills. And one of them was in Manchester, Vermont, near the Batten Kill River. And people were very upset about having a landfill near the Batten Kill River, which is a great, how many of you are Vermonters have heard? It's a great trout river. And so they said, you got to come down and explain it. That was a mistake, number one. And so Jonathan Lash and I and a couple other people, we got in this tiny little airplane, flew down to Manchester, and here was this angry crowd saying, how dare you build a landfill near the Batten? Well, we said it's going to be double lined, it's much better than your old landfill. Safety is our priority. No way. They would have none of it. So one of the challenges of creating change in the environment is, how do you really estimate risk? And how do you prove to people that the science is solid? As a decision maker, that's one of the hardest things. I'll give you another little story. We were going, again, I inherited this. There was supposed to be a waste-to-energy plant in Rutland. And in the 80s, that was considered an exciting new form of energy and conservation. It's supposed to be a win-win situation. You take the trash, you burn it, you produce cheap energy. Well, the mayor of Rutland very much wanted this plant for jobs. Unfortunately, it was sited in sort of a valley. Just before it was supposed to really start to be built, EPA came out with a new study that these plants emitted PCBs. And so, of course, the community was outraged. You're poisoning us. I told Jonathan Lash, well, also, a Japanese bank had lent money for this project, and at that time you wanted to do trade with Japan. So there were a lot of pressures to build it, and a lot of pressures not to build it. I asked Jonathan, find out how we can make this the most safe plant possible. Get rid of the PCBs and any other toxic elements that might have been. Well, very hard to do that. The literature just wasn't out there. The scientific information wasn't out there. The same with nuclear energy. I mean, in a lot of these kinds of decisions, it is very hard to find objective information. There are advocates from the industry, and EPA at that point just said, we've got a problem. It didn't tell us there was a solution to the problem. Well, to make a long story short, the reason the plant was never built was not because of the protests, but because of the cost. The Public Service Board changed the rate that this plant could charge for electricity, and that made it economically unfeasible. So it was never built. I'll give you a smaller story. My first Thanksgiving, I mean, everything seemed to happen the first year. I was having Thanksgiving dinner with my family, and I get a call from the Commissioner of Agriculture, Secretary of Agriculture. I get confused with the federal and the state. And he said, we've got a problem. I said, what? Well, in order to promote Vermont turkeys, he had designed these lovely green tags. And turns out that the green tags bled into the skin of the turkey. So suddenly we had green splotched turkeys. Were those turkeys, was the green poisonous? We didn't know. We finally decided on a solution, telling people just to cut out that piece of skin. But I still don't know to this day whether that dye was a problem. So we have a big problem not only of good science, but of perception of risk. And, you know, it's interesting. The genetically modified foods, GMOs, in Europe is a very hot issue. You know, when I was ambassador to Switzerland, one of the chemical companies came to see me because they were afraid that this anti-GMO campaign would come into the United States. Some people worry about the United States, but it's never been the same kind of issue. Are GMOs more dangerous in Europe than they are here? Genetically modified? We don't know. I noticed that the town of Plainfield, last town meeting day, voted against fluorides. Now you can get excited about fluorides, but all the scientific evidence tells you it's a fantastic way to prevent tooth decay in children. So all the scientific evidence goes one way. Somebody in Plainfield, and there was an effort in Burlington too, to ban fluorides. So there are really two questions. One is, where do you find the science? And two is, how do you educate people about the science so that you don't have panic where the danger is not real, but that you do have action where the danger is real. And it would be nice if we had a straightforward list of, you know, even a chart, you know, that showed us going from green to red where the dangers are. But all of these subjects are subject to debate and discourse. But having said that, there are still trends. that move in certain directions and opinions that begin to change. One of the probably most dramatic trends that's not directly but indirectly related to the environment is smoking. That was an area where industry had a very strong grasp on the facts, distorted the facts, hid the facts, but still the political system and the public have recognized the dangers of smoking by and large, though not everywhere. But we've changed our behavior, and we've been able to beat back, in most cases, not all, the special interests. Getting back to how you as individuals can have an impact. Obviously the personal, recycling, buying local, you know all these things. But how do you move into the larger realm beyond your own circumference? And this sounds simplistic, but it is so important. One is to be informed, to read, listen, talk, ask questions as much as you can. Because especially, in every field really in science, it is so important to have a grasp of the facts, of the latest information. And, the next is obviously voting. The next is working for an interest group, a non-government organization, I think can be effective. One of the interesting things in our democracy is how issues move from the outside to the inside. So if you want to be a radical at this point, that's fine. You may end up like me at some point. But the system needs pressure from the outside in order to move. And that has been true, of all political movements, whether it's the environment, whether it's the women's movement, whether it's peace movements. That's how a democracy eventually changes. But then, of course, you can do the obvious things, working for a candidate or running for office yourself. And that's one of my campaigns right now, is to get more women to run for office, and also anyone who's not part of the existing white male establishment, usually wealthy. Well, one of the let me just, we know the other chief barrier for environmental progress, in addition to trying to figure out risk, is economics. There are studies that have been made which try to find the equivalent of the gross national product, where you have numbers. You have hard numbers in economics. If you create 100 jobs, or if you invest this, if you pave a road, you're going to create possibly 100 jobs. If you give a tax credit on solar power, you can also create jobs, but the economics is still harder to pin down. Now, people have been working on this, but it is still not in a common, comprehensible vocabulary. One of the dramatic changes we've seen in just the last 2 months is a difference in perception of the economics of environmental protection and global warming. George Bush's chief argument against signing the Kyoto Treaty was it's going to hurt our economy. It's going to cost us jobs. And that is not, that was not his opinion alone. There's a lot of evidence to back that up. What has happened, I don't know, did anybody else watch Barack Obama's press conference Tuesday? Yeah. Well, he includes cap and trade as part of his economic stimulus, as part of our long-term investment in a sustainable environment. That is a huge change. But it's also going to be a hard sell, because a lot of the members of Congress don't buy into that or don't fully understand it. The other thing about environment is, and especially global warming or climate change, is it is not simply a partisan issue. It is to some extent that Democrats tend to be more pro-environment than Republicans, but it is also a geographic issue. So you will see a long-term Democrat, the longest, I think he now is the oldest person in the Senate, Senator Harry Byrd, comes from West Virginia, a coal-producing state. He's going to fight like the death for moving away from the traditional oil, gas, and coal economy. So it's not, one of the challenges is to prove to the Senator Byrds of this world that their economy will not collapse if we move away from coal to other alternatives. The biggest challenge, and Obama has put himself way out there, is can there be clean coal? And that's still a big question mark. I can't remember where I was, but I was watching television in another state, and I was very surprised by an ad, and I didn't catch who it was from. But the ad showed a little kid with one of these air freshener cans in a living room, spraying it, and all this black smoke came out of the can, and people started coughing. And then the cut line said, "Clean coal. Is this what you want for your future?" So there are people opposing clean coal or seeing it as unrealistic. But the economics of green jobs, green energy, are more long-term and are less definitively calculated. But there have been studies, and there are ongoing studies, that say, yes, this will work. I mean, we see it in very small companies in Vermont. NRG, are you familiar with that, in Williston? They produce the measuring instruments for wind turbines, and they're also going to produce a smaller wind turbine that you can have in your backyard. They're in the process of developing that. I went to that company. Wonderful place to work. Incredible loyalty, innovation, and these are good jobs. But those jobs, I mean, they started that company when Jimmy Carter was president, and there were tax credits for solar energy and wind energy. Ronald Reagan was elected. I don't know how many of you know, but he immediately took the solar panels off the White House roof. And the tax credits were withdrawn. So they had a hard time. If the tax credits, I think there are already some in the stimulus bill that was passed, but there would be more in the budget if it is passed. They will make a huge difference to whether that company can expand or not and sell, not in Vermont, but all over the country. So there is a direct linkage between jobs and tax credits and environmental policy. But it takes a little longer to make the case. They're not necessarily shovel-ready jobs, which is the term of the day, like you would have if you repaved Route 7 tomorrow. So we have to be more adept at making the case for the economics of it. And we have to also recognize that it is a hardship for the people of West Virginia, that it is really threatening to give up the coal economy. So we have to help them make that transition by moving to a different kind of economy, which always has some pain in it. And it's very hard, if you're going to be laid off tomorrow, for you to say, okay. There was a similar situation in or west, in the state of Washington and Oregon, when they stopped clear cutting in the Clinton years. And they did retrain people. I haven't checked on the situation recently, but we have to recognize that people do have a legitimate fear, and that we have some responsibility to enable them to stay economically viable. Sometimes, just in the last few days, there were a couple of articles in the New York Times which were interesting. Some people before this election said, "Oh, politics, they're all the same, they're all crooks. What difference does it make if I vote or not?" Well, in addition to Obama's budget message and outlook on sustainability, he has made some appointments which are dramatically different. One of the large concerns of the scientific community and others, that in the Bush years, basically ideology trumped science in many instances. In the acceptance, whether it's Darwinianism versus creationism, whether, of course, global warming was a reality or still an abstract theory. And, people like who used to be head of NOAA, James Jones, his reports on global warming were basically censored. And passages that said global warming is a real threat to us were excised. Now we have new people in these jobs, and the commitment. When Obama gave a speech on stem cell research, he made a very strong statement about allowing science to inform our decisions without putting this overlay. So the changes in the Bush administration were both in the people and in the results. There's a new head of EPA. This article in the Times of Tuesday, March 24th. The headline is "The Fight Plan for Clean Air." The Environmental Protection Agency, about to declare heat-trapping gases to be dangerous pollutants, has embarked on one of the most ambitious regulatory challenges in history. The move is likely to have a profound effect across the economic spectrum, affecting transportation, power plants, oil refineries, cement plants, and other manufacturers. It sets the agency on a collision course with car makers, coal plant owners, and other businesses that rely on fossil fuels, who fear that the fighting will impose complex and costly rules. But it may also help the Obama administration's effort to push through a federal law to curb carbon dioxide emissions, etc. So that's pretty dramatic stuff. And it's not going to be easy, because there are upfront costs. But of course there are long-term costs in terms of the emissions, in terms of national health, in terms of global warming for the globe. But if you want to know if politics makes a difference, this is one area. And as you know, the new energy secretary is a Nobel laureate. It's quite amazing that he was selected for this job. He is going through a kind of baptism by fire. There was an article also this week about how he appeared before a Senate committee on the Yucca plant that was supposed to be designated for nuclear waste, and Obama and he have come out against it. But John McCain decided he was going to grill him. And grill him he did. It was a very macho performance. And this poor guy, he was really being verbally beaten up. So one of the challenges is, how do you combine the scientific credentials which this man indisputably has with the political skills to deal with the John McCains of this world? Hopefully he will survive to do that. But it's not always the good guys versus the bad guys. There's another article in the paper. This was also March 24th. It says, environmentalists in a clash of goals. This takes place in Whitewater Canyon, California. What it turns out is that this beautiful area, David Myers scans the rocky slopes of this desert canyon, looking vainly past clumps of brittle brush for bighorn sheep. He imagines an enemy advancing across the crags. What's that enemy? Solar power. The specter of an army of mirrors, generators, and transmission towers transforming Mojave Desert, visitors like this one, etc. So, environmentalists want solar power. Environmentalists want to keep the Mojave Desert as it is. So, those are the tough decisions. Some of the wealthiest people in America have continued to oppose wind power off of Cape Cod because they have homes on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. Some of the good so-called environmentalists in Vermont have opposed wind power in the Northeast Kingdom. The governor has been totally or opposed to this wind power. The Burlington Free Press is opposed to wind power. As a result, Vermont really lags behind the rest of the country in developing this kind of alternative energy. You look on a good day across Lake Champlain, New York State has a very large wind power area, and the farmers love it. The poor farmers, who are poorer than most farmers of upper New York State, are getting paid for locating those turbines, and they're very happy. The reality is that there is no zero-sum game. Every form of energy exacts some cost. What we have to figure out is, how do you mitigate that cost as much as possible? Cost in terms of the environment and cost in terms of dollars. The state of Texas, the big oil-rich state of Texas, has the largest wind power development now in the United States. They are aware that oil isn't going to be there forever, and they are citing, and developers, businesses are investing in wind power. So we have, another classic example, of course, which is right also in our backyard, is nuclear power. One group of environmentalists says we should build more nuclear plants because the nuclear power does not emit any toxic emissions. Others say, hey, you're forgetting the risk, you're forgetting 3 Mile Island, you're forgetting the storage of nuclear waste, which is a long time. Which side are you on? Be an interesting discussion for your group. It puts a lot of people in a quandary. I find myself going back and forth. Today, the Vermont legislature is voting on whether or not Vermont Yankee should extend its license and decommissioning costs. So industry says, hey, this is cheap power. clean power. Should we go on? So it is not always a clear-cut case. One of the points, in addition to what I said, I'd like to make with you is the importance of communicating as a scientist, the importance of having your political antenna out there. And I happened upon another article, it was the same day, about the new chief of NOAA. The headline is, NOAA chief believes in science as social contract. Very interesting headline. And one of the reasons some people go into science because they think this is where truth is. We all have the evidence. We can do our work in the safety, protective, sanitized environment of the laboratory. We don't have to be besmirched by politics, by what is going on there. Well, I'd like to disabuse you of that. Politics is everywhere. First of all, it's also in the lab, as you'll soon find out. But what you create, what you investigate, depends on the public's ability to comprehend what you are doing and to accept it. So there has to be a dialogue from the get-go between the scientific community and the political community with a small p, which means the public at large. The marine ecologist Jane Lubashenko has long urged scientists to abandon the habitual reticence of the research community and spend more time engaging the public and public officials about scientific and technical issues. She's made the point I've been making in other classes just beautifully. She's a professor at Oregon State University. Is following her own advice all the way to Washington to head the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, one of the government's premier science agencies. This is only the latest step in a long career of practicing what she preached. In 1997, as president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dr. Lubashenko called for new social contract for science aimed at helping policymakers take steps to sustain the biosphere. So this is very dramatic and very positive. And I hope that she serves as a role model for other scientists, because you cannot work in a vacuum. You cannot immunize yourselves against social responsibility of the work you do and the political implications of the work you do. And it's not that hard. It does take time. Now, a lot of people say, I don't have the time. I'm doing this great experiment, and I don't have time to read the newspaper. I don't have time to call my congressman. I don't have time to give a speech to the Rotary Club or the Lions about my work or any other civic organization, or give a talk at the local library, or even do a blog that will reach out to a larger audience. But I urge you to consider yourselves as political in that large definition, to somehow blend in your own work and think about what the implications are of what you are doing. We need even stem cell research. You know, one of the reasons we have this great divide is because people are at extremes. Some say it'll cure everything. Others say you're killing embryos, babies. What we need is the dialogue to come together. But people need to be informed and able to do that in order to be able to do that. So I think you're living at a very exciting time. I don't know how many of you are graduate students or undergraduates or what you're going to do. For the women in this group, there's another little footnote in this article. I urge you to read the whole thing. March 24th, New York Times, you can find it. She shared a faculty appointment with her husband, and she had a child. And she and her husband continued their careers. Often, going back to my good friend Larry Summers, who said women can't do science because they don't want to work that long, they drop out of it. This is a little footnote, not from my theme of the day, but shows you that a scientist can be an outstanding scientist, have a political consciousness, and have a family. Big challenge for men these days too, who want to spend time with their children. So think about that in the future. But that's the last of my clippings. I don't know if I had anything else in my notes, but I guess my last pitch, which I have in my notes, don't underestimate your powers as a citizen. And some of you come from different states. So use your powers. And the Obama administration is going to need very vigorous grassroots support in order to get its exciting agenda enacted, because of what I already touched upon. Because we are in a polarized society. We are in a society where the comprehension of science is often vague, where there's a fear of science as well as great hope for science. We're very schizophrenic in regard to science. We expect you to make us live, enable us to live forever, but we're also afraid you're going to kill us. So let's stop at that note.
Thank you. We have time for questions. Comments or questions, rather. Tom?
A couple of times, Trevor, you made the point about bringing groups together for the purposes of informing one another. What do you do when one or more of those groups purposely misinforms with the intent of sort of changing the public's mind?
Give me an example.
Post. I think it was an organization that was formed during your administration. Private owners stand together. Remember that?
Yeah.
There was a lot of misinformation that came out of their group. And they convinced a lot of folks up in the Northeast Kingdom to close their lands to public access as a result. And they functioned on misinformation. And it was very difficult
you just have to counter it. One of the things I forgot to mention that I am pleased that the chief is governor, but it's always threatened, is the Housing and Land Conservation Trust Fund, which has put millions of dollars to save open land and develop affordable housing. Yeah, those folks were out there, and this was part of a law that I fought very hard for and developed, called Act 200, to help planning. Act 200 became kind of a rallying cry for the anti-planning folks. And yeah, I suffered from it, but the law still is there. So I think you just have to confront them and also try to form counter groups. Oregon passed this very far-reaching planning law about 20 years ago, 35 years ago. And it was also controversial, but they formed an organization called 1,000 Citizens for Oregon. And that provided a counterweight. So as far as I know, it may have been repealed or modified since, but it lasted for a long time because of that grassroots citizen activism. And I think that's the only way you counter it. And of course, now you've got wonderful tools with the internet. And, you can really reach so many people in ways that you couldn't before. But I think you can't just sit back and say they're wrong. You've got to stand up and say this is why they're wrong and this is what is right, even if it's uncomfortable. Yes.
It's an honor to have you here today. So thank you.
Nice to see you too.
Good to see you. I wanted to ask you if you could think about, and it doesn't have to be just in your administration, but if you could look back and think about a missed opportunity that you would cite, either legislation or a decision around Vermont and the environment, something that you would say, oh, if only something different, if you had the crystal ball to change it, what was that missed opportunity that you would say?
Well, I think we can still grab it, but I think that The missed opportunity really is in the energy field, in renewable energy. I mean, Vermont has such a wonderful reputation. We have an aura, which is probably better than we deserve. And I think we should have a real campaign to attract incomes through tax credits, through recruiting, through having a workforce that is trained for these kinds of jobs. Other states are doing, Europe is doing, I mean, Germany is way ahead of the United States. So I think that would be a win-win, economic and environmental benefit to us. It's interesting, you know, how things that are considered economic sacrifices turn out to be economic benefits. I can't take credit for this. This happened before I was in the legislature, and a Republican legislator proposed a law to ban billboards from Vermont. Everybody said, this is terrible. What are we going to do? We held on to that law, the only state in the union. Of course, you know, now it's a huge tourist attraction. And I heard a funny story on NPR before yesterday, where a man was driving around Vermont and stopped a farmer, and he said, I come from Massachusetts. When are you people going to get signs? I've been driving and been lost in Vermont for 3 days. And the farmer said, well, I'd rather be lost in Vermont than know where I am in Massachusetts. Any other question? Yes.
Governor, when you were Deputy Secretary of the Department of Education in the Clinton administration, I know you played a role in the President's Council on Sustainable Development.
Right, yeah, I remember that.
And of course, George W. Bush did not continue it when he... do you think it was effective, and would you recommend to President Obama that he set up something similar dealing with sustainability? And
yeah, I probably would set it up differently. I mean, what was interesting about it that time is that we had business representatives, and Jonathan Lash actually chaired it, and environmental representatives, but you still need the dialogue between these two groups. So, yeah, I think it's not a bad idea. I probably should have trouble with some of these things is you just talk. So I think you have to set some specific goals and an agenda, but I think, yeah, there's still a chasm of sorts, though some industries are recognizing, and I used to talk about this when I was governor. I mean, IBM saved money when it recycled its toxic waste rather than disposing of it. So even for business, you know, recycling is not only good for the environment, but economically viable. Yeah. Yes, you had a question.
Yes, I was wondering if you would comment on how you see the role of the press in this struggle with getting science out there in a good way. And what I'm talking about is, even the articles you quoted talk about, you know, a collision course and epic battles with war analogies and all of that. And we have so much interpretation. Blogs can be great, but before people even know what's involved in an issue, they're hearing the talking heads telling them what they should think. So how do you feel about that and the ability to get good information out?
And of course the press loves battles and the battle language, which is applied to just about everything. Yeah, and exacerbates the divisions. I think the only way you can counter that at all is through stories, through examples, through specific examples. You know, what is the impact on health? And by bringing up the communities that have been devastated. You know, you read about them almost every day, where suddenly people are finding that the water is toxic or the air, and you have higher rates of asthma in inner cities. I mean, we know these things. But I think the legislators learn through stories as much as through statistics. But powerful interest groups are out there, and the public has to become a powerful interest group. And that's been hard to do, but I think the Obama administration is trying to do just that. I mean, we had a very exciting election. And in case you didn't know what party I am, but anyway, we did, and a lot of young people participated, and a lot of people participated who never did before. And I still get emails from, MoveOn.org, from the administration. We've got to stay active. That's the only way. And in any way that you can. I used to say in any way that you're comfortable. I don't say that anymore. Be uncomfortable and get involved. But it's a very good question. And letters, old-fashioned things like letters to the editor. Some people think, like a Vermont legislator would get up on the floor of the House and say, I've heard from my people. You may have gotten 2 letters. And emails, of course, now you can let people know through emails, but letters are still good. Sometimes they don't pay attention to the emails. And not letters that are all the same, personalized letters and stories. Yes.
Something I've been thinking about, the Bush administration, how they wouldn't allow the polar bears to be listed as endangered, but rather threatened, because it would put restrictions on carbon emissions. Do you see that changing in the future?
I hope so.
Possible.
Because there's just a recent report, again, on polar bears, that they are threatened. So, you can't do everything at once. He's done a lot. Extraordinary. Now other people are criticizing him for taking on too large an agenda. And that's one of the criticisms against the cap and trade system he has in place. And health care. Can he do it all? But, if that's something you feel strongly about, let people know. And what state are you from? Vermont. Well, let your own congressional delegation know, but also let other people know, like the chairs of the Environment and Energy Committees. I'll just tell you one little story. The chair, before the Democrats controlled Congress, of the Environment and Energy Senate Committee was Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma. I see some people recognizing the name. He said global warming is the biggest hoax foisted on America. After the Democrats took over, Barbara Boxer, the senator from California, took over. And I happened to turn on the television, and it was when Al Gore was testifying before the committee. And Inhofe was grilling him. And Barbara Boxer said, your time is up, because each senator has a certain amount of minutes. And he kept on grilling Gore. And she said it again, and he kept on talking. And finally, he said, well, when I was chair of this committee, and she banged down her gavel, and she said, well, I'm chair now, and this is the way it's going to work. So, a chair of a committee has enormous power. So if you don't want to write 100 letters, write the letters to the chairs of those key committees, and they do need to hear from you. And don't stop. Don't stop, because they're not going to stop. The opposition is not going to stop. And the only way in a democracy we can counter the power of special interest groups is to become another public interest group.
Have we become too busy as a society in this economic system that we happen to, and I don't mean that as capitalism, but how we've played out capitalism?
Well, we're bombarded by so much information. In a way, we don't have good information, but in a way, we have TMI, too much information. So it's hard to sort through it, and it's hard to even know how you should spend the day. I admit, I decided to join Facebook. But now I find I have no time to really do it. And I'm not sure I want to tell everything about my life. But it's tempting, isn't it? It's tempting because it can be fun. There are a lot of demands on us today.
Good. Suzanne?
I have a question about that deals with Vermont and, you know, our budget problems now and what's being done as far as, you know, proposed budget cuts. And it seems to be that that the Agency of Natural Resources is being especially hard hit. That there, you know, the proposals to eliminate many of those positions, to close down the lab, the La Rosa lab, and whatnot. And just wondering what you think about that. How, you know, those of us who don't think it's necessarily a good idea should deal with
Well,
that.
it is a tough budget